Okay, so for step three, for those of you following the path of the local setup, now we get to the part of the whole reason you've learned this, which is really to work, to code, to stage, to commit, and to push. Really, all this means is do the work, stage it, commit it with the message I have for you, and then push it to GitHub, okay, so that you can share it with me or share it with the class. Okay, so I'm going to move over to Canvas for this particular item. And there's a couple things we want to talk about before you get started with the commands. One, and this one I think is now defaulted, but it's still worth mentioning. And it's in VS Code, make sure your auto save is enabled. And let me go ahead and bring up VS Code right now. And so I'm in VS Code, I'm in that base directory. Remember, yours will be different, possibly depending on what course you're in. And in here, if I go over to File, now I'm on my Mac, so this should be fairly same location for Windows. Autosave is defaulted by as on. And if it's not, you definitely want to make sure it's on, because as you work through the commands you're about to learn, if it's not on, you'll be committing and staging, committing, and pushing, and there won't be anything that shows up on GitHub. So just make sure this is on. Okay, that's the first thing, right? So autosave, and then make sure your current working directory is one of your repos. And for those of you working locally, there is one additional step that you could do, and actually it's the first command to see if this is true. Okay, so I'm going to go back over here, but for now, I'm going to go ahead and drop the terminal. Okay, what happens when you open this base folder in VS Code, right? And this base folder now becomes your root. So when you do terminal, when you run it, it will default into that base folder. Now that base folder is not a repo. So when you're doing the first command of get status, you may indeed receive a fatal, in which fatal is like, oh my gosh, they could use something different, right? But it's basically saying, hey, this base folder that you've created for your repos is not in and of itself a repo. So what you want to do, and there's two ways to do it. I think the best way to learn how to do this is to change directory. It's a command, change directory. And if I type Rio, and I hit tab, it'll actually read through my folders. This is going to be true for wherever you're working. And now it'll say, hey, I found two directories and they start with this, but then it stops at the R, okay? Because it's like, oh, here's where they're different. And so now you can just type the rest, okay? Private. Now that's one way to do it. There's another way that students often do it, and I'm going to drop the terminal again to show you this, is right-click, open an integrated terminal, and that changes it for you. So now a command, use pwd, shows me the directory, but the command I want you to learn is get. Now you have a message, and let me clear that and do get status again. So now you're on the, so this shows you first you're on a repo, a folder that is to your operating system a repo, okay? So when you're doing get status and you have this message, what this means is whatever is local here as far as code is the same thing that is true out on your repo. So I'm looking at the private repo out on GitHub. Okay, so for right now, they're both the same. And that's what this message is. Nothing to commit, nothing new. But if I go into the README file and I say, let's do spring 2025, or whatever semester you might be watching this in, notice how one of the things, and I believe this is true no matter what color theme you're using, this turns to yellow, and this means modified. And you can see it there on the tooltip if you can see that, which you should be able to at the very end where it says modified. And the reason it's modified is just that you have modified a track or a file that GitHub is already tracking. Okay, so if I do get status now, it's going to tell me, oh hey, there's changes not staged, which totally makes sense. It's totally you know, when you start to read it, it starts to make sense. And then you kind of go, after a while, you just like, oh, okay, that's what that means, right? So in other words, now I have a change. Now this is a minor change. When you're doing code in this work, there may be, of course, more change than that. But I just want you to know the difference, because there will be different kinds of colors that will show up, and I'm about to show you another one. Okay, so first we've done this change. And we could go ahead, and by the way, let me just tell you this, is we could go ahead and do the rest of this Git workflow and actually push that one specific change to GitHub, okay? But I'm actually going to show you another change that I want you to do, because this is something that should help you over time, okay? So let's come in here, because we're going to actually make more changes to this file. In the assignment, I've given you a link to a GitHub Git workflow markdown file. It's enough to say, okay? And when you come into here, I think this may look a little different for you depending on browser and all that, which by the way, Chrome is generally the browser I recommend. But in this case, I'm going to copy all of this content here, okay? I'm going to copy all that content right there, okay? And there's a reason. Now I'm going to go, so I've copied the content out of that file, and now under my private repo, I've selected that repo. I'm going to create a new folder, because this is very common. The thing you do in this course is you create folders. So Git, and I'm going to say help. Okay, so this is a new folder I've created, Git help. So now I have a new folder, but notice if I do Git status here, there's really no change in the message, because just creating a folder doesn't really, there's nothing it's tracking, although once we create a file in that folder, it will be, and that's what we're about to do. So now, while this is selected, let's create a readme.md file. Now why a readme file? Because generally when you're looking at your repos, and again, depends on which class you're at, but it will generally always show you the readme file by default. So let's go ahead and hit that. So now, notice how this is different. This is now U, which means it's untracked. So now, where we modified before, we now have a file that is untracked to the system, okay? So if we do git status, okay, it's going to say, oh, hey, I now have this folder, but I know there's untracked files in here, which by the way, there's nothing in this file right now. So if I was to do it, and this is, I had already copied it, I'd paste in that content from before, okay? So this will be in the future if you ever want to come back and not have to go all the way back into Canvas to find this. I've added it here, okay? So now, and by the way, if we didn't have autosave turned on, this would not have shown up the way that way I see it, and hopefully the way you see it. So now, again, I can do, by the way, I can use my up arrow, do git status again. There's nothing new here. So now I'm ready to do the first, and let's just go back because it's a little easier to see. So now we're going to stage our changes. So we've modified. Now we know we have changes and we're going to add. So this first one is to say, you know, add anything that I have changed, right? So if I do this right now, it would get the change I did to the README file in the base, or not in the base, but in the repo private folder, and it would get that new folder and that new file. Okay, so it's gonna, when I run the following command, and this is what so make it clear. So git add star. It's going to go through everything from this base folder and it's going to add it up, add it into my staging. It's going to, oh, hey, I'm staging it. By the way, I'm still local. I haven't done anything to change GitHub yet. This is all in my local system. But notice how now I have an A4 index added. Okay, so now if I do git status, I can see, oh, okay, I have a modified file and I have a new file. Great. So again, this status is helpful because it tells you, hey, this is what you've done. And by the way, there's an interface over here for GUI, for a graphical user interface, if you ever wanted to see it. I just find the sooner you learn some command line, the better. Okay? All right, so now going back here, The other thing, if you ever had a need to, you could add, instead of the star meaning everything, you could have added a specific file name. So there, if I wanted to, I could have just, and that actually would have been interesting, because if I had done it from here and I have two files, it probably would have only found the one in the current directory I was in. Now, don't worry too much about that, because most of the time you do this. So now we're still working locally, so now we're going to commit, okay? So you can follow along, and this is where I generally will give you a commit message, and I'll give you one today that I want you to do. So let's do a clear git commit -m for a message. And by the way, if you ever hit enter here, it'll be weird, because it'll kind of act like, hey, you need to finish that line, and you can try to finish it. But if something happens, worst case scenario, you can always drop these. And I'm not going to go over that troubleshooting yet, but if you want, reach out to me. I'd be happy to chat about that. Okay, so in here, we're going to say learning git workflow. Okay, cool. So now notice all of our coloring is gone. Right? And so now if I do git, and by the way, I can use up arrow, I'm going to clear and then up arrow. Git status now tells me something different. Is your branch, which in this case is main, okay, is ahead of your origin main. And by the way, what this means is your GitHub, right? So right now, if I went to look at GitHub, it does not match what I have locally, okay? And so this is where you work locally. You do your staging, you do your committing, and then you do the last step in here, which is your git push. Okay? And so when you do git push here, right now it has pushed that code. And if I did git status, I would now see that original message when I did the first git status when we started this that says, hey, working tree is clean, which means if I refresh this, I now see that folder and that file out on GitHub. Okay? All right, so this is how you work through the course. And then the last thing I'll show you is very often I will say, show me your commit history. So right now, this URL is showing me the repo. So if I hit history, very common, and you will see me say this a lot, and what you should see is you may for work in this class have like 4 or 5 commits that you've had to do, and when you give me this commit history URL, and by the way, you can tell by looking at the URL, I know it's a little hard to see here, but it has commits in there and you see the commits. Okay, so congratulations, you now have the tools you need for this course. Okay, and my last message at the bottom is like, congrats, right? You've set up your development environment. Now, for each of you, there'll be a different next step. Wow, that Giphy thing is long. There'll be a next step that you will have to do, and there'll be some content for you specifically down there. But this is what you were here to learn. And again, you'll do this again and again and again. Please reach out for help if you need anything. All right, talk to you later.